Going to the cloud. Okay. Hello everyone. Office hours. Welcome to my apartment. Everyone at Fishtown Analytics is now working from home from now until we don't know when. A quick update from myself. Jeremy and myself went to Montreal last week to run our second in-person Learn, and it was an absolutely fantastic experience. We've cancelled the upcoming in-person Learns, and we are figuring out how we can make this work in other mediums. So more to come on that as we figure that out ourselves. It's sort of uncharted territory for us. But I'm confident that we can pull something together that will be valuable to people. What else is going on in my world? We're working on some docs updates. Maybe Drew can share a little bit of that. I don't know if that was a smile like you're ready to share right now. Do you want to show the docs updates?
I'll show a docs update.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, let me get it situated here. I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, this is the documentation site that's been serving DBT users well for a few years now. This is using a hosted product called readme.io that was a great way for us to get started with documentation. But increasingly, we're finding that it's easy for docs to get out of sync, especially between versions, because, well, README has a version of a thing that looks like version control. It's not really like Git or proper version control at all. And so instead, we've migrated to an open source docs website called Docusaurus, which you can see here. And we've just completed porting over all of our old documentation for README to this new site. It's living at tutorial.getdbt.com right now, but it'll be at docs.getdbt.com very soon. And so all the documentation here is kind of one-to-one with what it looked like previously. But the really compelling thing is that we have better tools for organizing the data. So you can see we have docs here. This is the Getting Started tutorial, which if you haven't seen it, is a great resource that Claire worked very hard on. You can see all these code snippets and sort of video tutorials for how to get started with DBT. And so we can make compelling new sections of the documentation like this. You can also see FAQs. This is a great resource if you're ever stuck on what feels like a common question. And the really awesome part, I'll just show this real quick. This isn't going to be publicly useful to most people, but we have the ability to write custom components in the doc site. And so you can see an overview of how we can do that. And so you can put this React code right in your Markdown and render out, these are callouts. If there's ever a thing that it differs between DBT Cloud and DBT Core, we can kind of have these tabs to easily encode that information. We can expand and collapse sections, link to FAQs, things like this. And so here's a really great feature that's worth calling out because it's kind of reminiscent of DBT. This is a compiled set of Markdown files that become a documentation website. And so we get to inspect all of these links that are rendered out. And if there's an invalid link, we underline it in red, and the docs will actually fail to build. And so hopefully we'll never have a broken link in the documentation. We'll catch it at build time. And then easy embeds for videos too. So this is, for the most part, one-to-one with our existing doc site at the moment, but very much the goal is to leverage this thing to its full potential. And so we'll be reorganizing some of the documentation to make it easier to consume, splitting out long articles into different discrete sections, and hopefully building some new components that make it easier to understand and use DBT.
Cool. Well, Drew, do you just want to continue on and share some updates on 0.16.0?
We'll keep going.
Just a heads up that I have to bounce at 12:30. If we're still going, I'll pass the meeting control over to you or to Jeremy.
All right, sounds great. Thanks, Claire. All right, so there's what do we got? It's 16 people, looks like, on here. Seen some faces. Good to see all of you with your cameras on.
16 people in version
16.
16. Wow.
Oof, all right, pretty good. So has anyone here installed and used the DBT 0.16.0 pre-release already? No, okay, again, some no nods.
Drew,
yeah, Josh,
Drew, this is Josh. Yeah, we've upgraded one of our projects in DBT Cloud to using it, and everything's run fine, no issues, no problems. We haven't been installing and downloading and installing it locally yet because we haven't made any changes on that project. We're planning to do so in the next few days.
Sounds good. I always appreciate the sort of knack, like negative acknowledgement that nothing's broken. It feels like we only ever hear when things aren't working correctly, which is also valuable. But thanks for the heads up, Josh. And Max, it sounds like you're on 0.16 as well. Everything good with you on that front? Awesome, glad to hear it. Max says yes in the chat. So let me go ahead and share my screen again. There's a discourse post that we wrote up here, and we're sort of adding to over time. Maybe the background that's important to give is that DBT's installed software, and so we don't want to just pump out a new version that hasn't been widely tested by everyone. And so we do what's called a pre-release. And so in our case, the first pre-release that we put on PyPy was 0.16.0 beta 3. The reason we use this beta tag is if you still pip install DBT, you'll get the last non-pre-release, so 0.15.2 right now, I think it would be. But you can specifically install this pre-release, try it out, see how it works. So there are the most significant change that you'll see from a modeling perspective in here is something Jeremy's going to talk about. It has to do with improvements to how we generate incremental merge statements on BigQuery. And it's a fascinating conversation approaching black magic territory. But some of the other things that are worth calling out are some of these like often requested features or common sources of bugs that we fixed. One of these is the generate database name macro. And so one of these already exists for schemas and aliases, but now you can make a macro that dynamically configures the target database for a model. This is really helpful if you want to say, these models should go in this database versus these models go in that database in a dynamic fashion based on, say, environment, user, things like that. Another big one, the reason this is 0.16.0 and not, say, 0.15.3 or 4 or something like that is because of this change that we're making to how we parse CSV files in DBT. So if you've ever run DBT seed before with maybe a funny looking CSV, you might have seen really curious error messages from DBT. It's because we're using a CSV parsing library that does type inference. And it was pretty clever, I guess is a nice way of saying it, and how it would infer types for different strings. And so if you had the value Sunday, DBT would, or the library really that DBT used for type inference, and therefore DBT, would convert that Sunday to this date, or really the first Sunday after this date, which was never what anybody wanted. Or if you had a column called next Tuesday, it would literally give you next Tuesday's date, which was always changing, which was not what you wanted. This led to a bunch of bugs. It was very confusing, and we've rationalized that behavior in DBT, and so CSVs will work more normally in DBT seed. But that's what makes this a breaking change. It'll be worth inspecting your CSVs and making sure that you weren't relying on the old, previous, pretty quirky behavior. And this can be like a pretty conversational endeavor. So if anybody has any thoughts or comments here, please feel free to chime in with what you're thinking. One of the other big changes that you're going to see here, hopefully you'll notice, is that if you're using Snowflake, startup time should be a lot faster. DBT needs to run a bunch of queries at the beginning of a run to just, for instance, figure out which schemas exist in a Snowflake database. We used to do so using a query to the information schema, but there's a really great thread on it in the DBT Slack. If anyone's curious, we can talk about the specifics. At a high level, we've made that a lot faster by changing the type of query that DBT runs. We now run show schemas in database instead of selecting from information schema.schemata or something like that. There's a bunch of benefits. The thing you'll see is just that it's faster. Beyond that, we've also parallelized these queries. So if your DBT run should target multiple databases, we'll run a query to see which schemas exist in those databases in parallel. The time between you typing DBT run and DBT actually building things will reduce on Snowflake. Actually, this is parallelized on every database, so you'll see benefits on BigQuery, Redshift too. They'll be the most pronounced on Snowflake. Now, one of the other really cool things that we're doing here is building out the capabilities of these YAML specifications for models. And so you can now, here's an example, you can now tag columns or tests. This allows you to select them in a dbt test invocation. So if you do have tests that maybe are particularly slow to run or say maybe expensive, you can tag those and exclude them from specific runs. Or the opposite, if there are tests you always want to run in specific ways, you can include those tests as a part of your deployment workflow.
Now that tags live in schema.yaml, what happens to tags that live in config blocks?
It's a good question. I think one of the next projects we want to do is kind of reconcile the configuration that happens in these YAML files with the configurations that happens for models. Right now, the two are separate, but I think there's probably no reason you shouldn't just be able to configure a model here. So say there's a config block and you could say, if you want materialized table, I personally don't think that would be the right place to put that information, but I think you should be able to do it just to make this all a little bit more sensible. And vice versa, it'd be totally reasonable if we allowed the specification of column configs in a model, where again, you probably wouldn't want to write out a big description in the config block at the top of your model, but they would use the same configuration mechanism under the hood. And so you could do that if you wanted to. Were you thinking about something in particular, or just curious?
Oh, I wasn't sure if I'd have to update my old models that had tags on them, whether can I tag a model from my from my schema YAML files?
Yeah, so it's funny, it's pretty inconsistent. You can only tag columns and tests on those columns here, but I would like it to all be going through exactly the same code path where you can configure whatever, wherever you'd like, wherever makes sense.
Yeah. And we're still saying dbt test -m for models. Tag my test tag. How do you feel about that?
-m is probably going to change to -s or --select. That'll make a lot more sense. And we have an issue queued up for our next minor release. It's going to be called the Octavius Cato. It'll be 0.17.0, I think, in which there will be a sort of code-based mechanism for declaring selectors like this, which is a lot more flexible than the command line. Jeremy's actually been leading the charge there. We can pull up the issue and talk about it if anyone's curious. I think Josh A might be. And so you can do things like intersect selectors. So I'll give you a broad example. Maybe this happens, maybe it doesn't exactly shake out like this, but just say select all models materialized as incremental that have this tag, but that don't have this other tag, is the kind of query you could run to select and run models or tests. And so we'll make this selection syntax more flexible in that way. It's a great question. The -m is not, this is a big problem. The fact that you select tests with -- models, it limits the types of things that you can select in a not great way at the moment. But this is how you do it for the moment. So, the good news is we have a brand new documentation site where we can explain exactly how this works and make a version control change in the future. Okay, so there's some other big changes to the documentation website, and they're worth calling out here. For those of you who have installed 0.16.0, I'm curious if you've generated the docs and looked at them at all. And not all at once, because we're on Zoom, so it's hard if you're all talking at the same time to hear.
Not yet on my end.
Okay. I was kidding. Thank you. I appreciate that. So, okay, let's take a quick survey of some of the new functionality in the docs website. There's some specific YAML configs that you'll want to apply to enable some of this functionality, and we can take a tour of that too if anyone's interested. So the first thing you're going to notice is there's a dbtutils entry under projects here. So you can now document macros. And so we'll take a look at some macros. We'll start maybe in the SQL folder, and we'll look at what's a common one. How about union relations? This one's pretty common. And so none of these are documented yet in dbtutils because we haven't released 0.16.0 yet, so we haven't written the documentation for these macros. But it's going to happen. If anyone's interested in helping out, this is like a great way to get involved with contributing to dbt. And so this actually isn't great because you can't see the arguments or references. Although in JAFLeshop, I have to think about this. There's an example here somewhere I can pull up where we use this. You'll see you can note the models that reference a given macro. If you're looking at the macro docs, okay, where's this used? Similarly, you can enumerate the arguments for the macro and say, You know, this takes, in this case, relations, column override is optional, includes a list, exclude, things like that. You can document these things in line, say how to use the macro. That'll be like really very compelling once we have documentation built out. And the other cool thing is we have these cross DB utils. And so maybe some folks here have used them, like say date diff. Claire, is this a newly contributed macro, the Postgres implementation for date diff?
Yes, someone from Betterment contributed this.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember that I clicked this one kind of by accident, but it's a great example of a recently contributed macro from someone in the community. And so what we can see here is this is a type of adapter macro where the actual definition of date diff is just shelling out to a database specific implementation. And we can click through all the different implementations for, you know, this is the default if no plugin specific override exists. Here we can see how we do it on BigQuery. Here's the Postgres implementation. Things like Redshift and Snowflake would use the default implementation in this case. And so it's a great way of exploring what the actual macro code is that's going to run on your particular database. So those are macros. You can write macro docs in these schema.yaml files. And crucially, Claire pointed this out, you can now specify these YAML files in your macros directory so you can document your macros next to their definitions. Okay, some other things. We've got documentation for analysis files. You can look at the compiled code, copy to your clipboard. You can write the docs for a really cool analysis. This is a CI kind of setup, but you would write good documentation here for your organization. CSVs are actually unchanged. They haven't, they're documentable now. That's been true for a little bit at this point.
But only in your models directory still, right? TBD.
That's a really good question. I think we changed that. I think that, Claire, do you want to take a note of that, and I'll check it out after this call?
Yeah.
It's a good point. This is why
Actually,
we do pre-releases. Yeah, go ahead.
I have the same question about snapshots. We've been assuming that YAML and documentation for those have to live in the models directory, but maybe we were wrong. I don't know.
That should have changed, and there actually isn't an example of snapshots being documented here. They are rendered in the doc site now, and they should be using the configured snapshot paths to figure out to find YAML and markdown files. And if that's not the case, we should fix it in this pre-release. It should be pretty quick, if so. Great question. Okay, here's an example of a macro just with some built-out documentation. You can see the arguments, type, description. You can expand it if you have a long-form description. And similarly, you can link to a model. So this model here is using, I didn't want to mess up JavaShop too much as a part of this project. I just wanted some CI tests to exercise the documentation functionality. So you can see we're calling this macro here. And back on the macros page, we can see that it's referenced in stage orders.
Can you share the code that generated the descriptions? Like, how do I actually add this to my project?
Yeah. So this is going to be
in Grapple Shop.
What do you mean? The pull up the repo, or?
Yeah, like if I want to go ahead and document a macro, what is the code that I need to write in my own project?
Yeah, so I did something funny. I didn't actually update JavaShop directly because I'm doing some funny stuff just to stress test the CI build. But we can take a look here. And also the documentation for 0.16.0 is in progress and hopefully coming very soon. So macros, we should see, okay, here's a macros.yaml file in the macros directory. And you can see this is the specification. So same looking thing as models, but you give arguments instead of columns, and it accepts a type parameter, where this is all free form, but hopefully we'll have good conventions about how to use types consistently. Yeah, it's going to look just like this for the most part, docs to come.
Go.
Anyone ever see these potential security vulnerabilities? I think that's only visible for maintainers. I'm going to check that one out. Okay, so moving along, there's a new thing I want to show you here. This was a feature contributed by Taylor A. Murphy, PhD, of the GitLab team. You can specify, here I'll show you the code that generates this too, so that we know what we're looking at. Let me come back to DBT docs, CI project, models. And this model that we're looking at is stage payments. So we'll pull up stage payments in schema.yaml. You can see there's a new meta config that you can supply here. And you can put arbitrary key value information. So in this case, I'm saying the owner is true, contains PII is true, SLA is 1 hour. You can put whatever keys you want here as long as they're strings. And it'll get rendered out in this kind of top level details line if the meta is available. And so I think PII, owner tags, and SLAs are great use cases for this kind of meta configuration. But I'm sure there are others. And if anyone has any good ideas offhand of what they'd want to put here, I'd be really curious to hear about them. Jericho, you got any good meta tags you're itching to add to your models?
Yeah, like a good old unsupported tag. Don't use true.
Sure, like deprecated.
Yeah.
I love it. Like, don't use true rather than use this false.
I do actually think it would be kind of cool to like last refactored or like originally written, so that you can see a model and see, oh, like this is from 2017.
That's pretty interesting. One of the cool things that isn't super apparent from looking at this is that there's a well-structured JSON artifact that's used to power this documentation generated from your project. And so by encoding metadata as a well-structured key value pair here, you could track these things longitudinally and see like, okay, how did this change over time? That all that information is there. And yeah, I think that like when the model is added is, that information is available in the Git repo, but depending on who the consumer is, like putting it in the documentation could be a good example of a way to use this. And yeah, same thing, like maybe the level of support provided for a table, like this is experimental, this is pre-release, this is in prod, this is deprecated, things like that. Could also be really cool. Okay, the rest of this should be the same. We've got meta tags. And okay, what are the big thing here? New documentation. You can now document custom data tests. And the same ideas apply where this is a YAML file. The top level keyword is tests. Give the name of the schema, the custom data test, and then you can give documentation about what it is. And crucially, look at the compiled code and run it yourself if the test should fail. These tests participate in the graph, which is pretty interesting. If you all hate this, I'm going to throw it back in your faces for not building the docs in the pre-release phase, but this is a good opportunity for us to look at it here. So a couple new things to call out in the DAG view. One is you can now filter by resource type here. So if we want to look at just say only tests and analyses, we can do that. Analyses are also graph aware. So we can do filtering if that's helpful, maybe only like, models, analyses, and tests. That's sort of a stopgap for a more comprehensive model selector that allows you to specify resource types at selection time. But until such thing exists, this is a good way to work around that. And let me update the graph. Okay, the other thing is we have a notion of hiding models now. And so there's this hidden model, which is hidden in the documentation. You don't see it in the sidebar. It doesn't render in the database view. And this is like, if you do have models you don't want to expose to consumers of the docs, we still want them to show up in the DAG view. Otherwise, things will get pretty nonsensical if you're missing a link in the DAG. But it's kind of disabled looking, and if you view it, it's called out that it's hidden. So that should be cool too. Probably more to do for things like this. I think that increasingly there's a lot of different types of things here. We're not just looking at models anymore. And so the way that, we're coloring sources differently than models, but we really should do something similar for custom data tests and analyses. And you can imagine styling models differently by their materialization, things like that. And so very interested in figuring out a good way, to encode all that information. Jericho, go ahead.
Drew, I still want the sources to turn red if they're not fresh too.
It's a good idea. This is the other big conversation about artifacts that's interesting is every time you run DBT, we're going to clobber this new chat. Okay, we're going to clobber this run results.json file with the output of the last run. And so if you do dbt docs generate, we're going to overwrite run results.json with the compiled SQL output from like the dbt compile invoked by dbt docs generate. Anyway, this is just to say, if you were to have a chain of build steps like dbt source snapshot freshness, dbt docs generate, it'd be great to combine those run results and feed all that information into the doc site so we can render like statuses. I think that's an excellent idea, making sources red. And
while we're at it, if that is done, it would be nice to have the ability to not just have set categories of things be assigned colors, but to be able to, I know you can select by tag in here, but what I would like is the ability to like auto define things that are tagged certain ways. Well, that's a little tricky because tags can have multiple values, but I'd like to be able to assign certain categories of things arbitrary colors. And what I mean by that is, so we're building another like kind of internal analytics project at on-prem, and we have a set of source tables and then snapshots on top of those, and the sources are all colored green. And, you know, maybe there's a different color snapshots could be assigned, but then on top of the snapshots, we're building another set of what we're calling filter views, which are like deduplicating and friendly column naming and data typing, because we don't want to do that in the snapshots. We just want the snapshots to kind of pull in whatever comes from the sources. Well, what I'd love to be able to do is assign like the filter views or filter models another color in the DAG. So when the analysts or the folks who are working on the DAG, like they can clearly see, oh, and that's the filter layer, if that makes sense.
That totally makes sense. And it makes me think about this same, I'll give you an example. This is how you hide a model in the documentation. There's no reason we couldn't put like color here. But the thing is, something like colors, especially, though I'm thinking about it the same way, you mostly want to color by groups of things, not discrete models, like every model's a different color. C. Claire, feel free to make me the captain. Perfect, thanks. Talk to you later. Yeah, so you probably want to configure these things not necessarily always at the model level, but maybe at a group or tag level. And I want to leverage the hierarchical configs from like dbt project.yaml. And so I want you to be able to specify like a docs as a config in dbt project.yaml and say docs color hex code or whatever it is, or the docs for everything with a given tag is this color, you know? I really like the way that you're thinking about that. I think it's a good approach. And I think in addition to color, there's probably a good way for us to have like icons for different things to improve like the information density of.
Yeah, and then like all my dimensions could be a certain color, and all my fact tables could be a certain color, stuff like that too.
Sure.
Right.
Now, okay, I don't want to get too far into this. Maybe this is a separate office hours, but I do want to show you because I think it's pretty neat how this code actually works. So I'll show you app. I'll show you services. I'll show you the graph service. If you're impressed with all this code, I will take all the credit. If you think it's terrible, I will defer to the engineering team at Fishtown Analytics. I'm just kidding. So one of the really cool things that we can do here is effectively apply a style guide based on node properties. And so here we're saying vertical edges. Well, maybe that's a less interesting example. I'll show you a good one. Here's how we say that source nodes should be green and selected nodes should be, I think purple is ultimately this color. We can do something like this where you don't have to be so config heavy for maybe some of these styles, because I think it's kind of a weird, like the model config's a weird place to specify the node icons and colors and outlines and things like that. Instead, maybe what we can do is have the ability for you to supply a style guide, like a CSS kind of selector like this, that says, you know, source nodes are this color, or nodes with this given tag are that color. And the onus is on DBT just to apply these selectors appropriately so that you can match them in some sort of style sheet. I don't know if this makes any sense to anybody who hasn't looked at this code before, but this is just to say I think it's a good path forward for letting users specify node styles based on arbitrary user land configs.
Yeah, I like the sound of that.
Cool. Okay. I think we make that happen. There's an open PR here that we haven't moved on, but there was some great work in the past, and yeah, you can see that we marched in the docs direction to support showing and hiding. And also there's a question in Slack, is the hidden model name, is that the actual name of the model, or is it obfuscated? Yes, it's just rendering the actual model name from the chat here. But yeah, there's no reason we can't do something like this. And I think the more it looks like CSS styling, the easier it is going to be to configure every part of what it looks like. So cool. Thanks, Max. I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, I think that it makes sense that the information wouldn't necessarily be within the DBT YAML files, although that could be interesting. I also see that it makes a lot of sense to have a separate CSS file that you can sort of customize for your own needs, and that is just it's information that's specific for the docs part of the project, and it doesn't really add value anywhere else.
Sure. You know, in that lens, it's maybe the configuration you want to apply here is, if anything, classes, so that you can just affix a class to a model or a set of models, and then let the style sheet dictate how to render nodes with those classes.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, great. I think that is all the new stuff in the documentation. We were pretty long overdue on some of these things, supporting custom tests, macros, analyses, snapshots are in here too. Anything new in sources? I don't think so. That's the big overview. So I do encourage you all, as with any JavaScript project, working on my machine says very little about what it'll do on your machines. So I'd encourage you all to pull this stuff up, take a look, and let us know if you have any issues or if there are things that you think could work differently. All right. In that case, well, I did stop sharing my screen, but we were only halfway through the pre-release stuff. I guess, let me just take a quick scan here through the discourse post. You can find a link to this discourse post in the release notes, and I'll add it, I'm sorry, in the releases channel in Slack, and I'll also drop a chat in here with it if you want to follow along too. This is the Barbara Giddings release. And Jericho, correct me if I'm wrong, but the other big thing to talk about here is going to be the BigQuery incrementalism. Is that right?
I think so. I think so. And there's a lovely transition from one to the other based on Klaus's comments on that discourse post.
Okay. Do you wanna take over at this point?
Sure. So this is also a long time coming. You know, there's an issue from kind of way back when, number 1034, and it's stretching all the way to an issue that I opened yesterday, 2196. That's over 1,000 DBT issues and pull requests. This is my white whale. I'll keep chasing it. But it's pretty exciting. DBT has long supported incremental models. I think I want to share my whole screen on BigQuery in general, and with a decent amount of success. But especially as data volume gets bigger and bigger, the target table that you're potentially merging into is also getting bigger and bigger. And previously, there was no good way or no baked-in way for DBT to filter the target table to just insert data, assuming you have a partitioned model, into the partitions that you most care about, meaning the partitions that represent, let's say, the last few days of data that you're running new transformations for. As a result, if your table is particularly big, you're going to keep scanning the entire table every single time you run, and there's going to be some cost associated with that, even though the runtime is actually still quite performant. So this is an issue that we've gone kind of back and forth on for a long, long time, and there's a whole lot of conversation here, and you can click onto another PR and another PR after that and really follow the whole trail of things. But where we've landed is, and this is still a little bit work in progress, but where we landed, meaning during yesterday afternoon after work, was supporting a new incremental strategy on BigQuery. Now, I don't know if any of the Snowflake users are familiar with the fact that Snowflake has two different incremental strategies. There's a merge strategy and a delete and insert strategy. On BigQuery, we are going to be supporting merge as the simple default, and then also insert overwrite. What does this mean? It means that we are going to ask BigQuery to replace an entire partition, to drop a partition of data and insert data from our new incremental model. So is it clear to everybody when I talk about like old versus new? As in we've got a table and we're running incrementally on it. So there's old data already in there and new data that we have just transformed, just scanned and transformed. So this is all going to be written up and much more publicly available and accessible, and probably a conversation that we're going to continue. But in doing this work, we ran into a couple of sort of interesting observations. One is that, and this is with the help of Klaus like yesterday, apparently adding a cluster key on BigQuery improves merge operations. It doesn't even need to be clustered by the unique key that you're merging, like that you're matching on during the merge. It can be clustered on anything and it will somehow manage to prune the total table that you're merging into. This is, I think, undocumented. It wasn't true maybe more than 6 months ago. I don't know when it became true, but it is very, very cool. And so we did a whole bunch of work to support this kind of more manually, and then realizing actually the easiest version of this for small data sets is probably just to add a cluster key, and you're already going to be saving some time and saving some money. But the more complicated version of this is, again, insert overwrite, which is going to perform much, much better at larger data volumes. For anyone who's familiar, it takes its name from a Spark function, and the functionality is going to be fully analogous, even though the DDL or the DML looks very different. So it won't use the unique key at all. We are offering an optional partitions config, at least this is the plan, so that you can specify, hey, I want to run for exactly these days. So like I'm gonna grab new data on March 11th and March 12th, and then replace the partitions of March 11th and March 12th. You could obviously write up some macros, use some datetime functionality. dbt imports the Python datetime function module rather into its Jinja environment. So there's ways to really macrotize this and wrap this a little more nicely. But you can imagine this is something you're going to be doing in more of a conventional data engineering workflow. If you don't, however, specify this partitions config, instead, you can still use the insert overwrite method, and dbt will do its very best to kind of like dynamically figure out which partitions it wants to be replacing. It'll even give you this dbt max partition kind of like wildcard variable to use in your model SQL. And this whole approach, this dynamic approach, is actually leveraging a pretty new BigQuery feature called scripts, where you can declare variables in plain text, and then over the course of several steps, actually set those variables based on queries you're running, even if those queries are hitting like tables or temp tables that you're creating as part of the same script. Has anyone had a chance to play around with scripts? Yeah, Drew. Anybody else? They're pretty neat. Let's see if I think I've got one open here. So you actually, it's just one big SQL statement that you run, and there are semicolons along the way, and each of these semicolons is interpreted as its own query to run as part of the script. And so BigQuery will split it up into multiple steps, and you see here, this is where basically it finds the beginning of each step, like line 110, position 46. And then each step has stages, and they run exactly in order. And you can see, here you can see the queries that are run, but also you can view the results of each step along the way and how many bytes were processed in executing those results, and then the total overall time. So it's like quite cool. The only downside is if you, I think this is saying this because it has already run, but it doesn't usually tell you how many bytes are going to be processed in advance. You have to kind of proceed through. So good question. Do steps equal SQL transactions? No, this does not, like there's no sense of rolling back the results of previous steps if one step fails. This is not an atomic operation. It's just a super convenient way to run a bunch of SQL in order, and we don't have to use kind of complicated DBT statements or run query like Jinja steps to get the values of a previous query and interpolate them into a future query. But no, it's not a transaction. So this is the way that we do it dynamically, and you can see that there's a couple of steps along the way. First, we get the max partition value to give you this like variable, as I mentioned, to play with in your model SQL, create the temporary table. Then there's a final, or we figure out which partitions should be replaced by selecting the distinct values from that temporary table, and then run a final merge statement that only will merge into, or sorry, will only replace those partitions which were identified in the temp table. I lost the chat here, but oh wait, here we go. How long do the created variables live for? Only for the duration of the script. Yep. Yeah, so as soon as the script is over, those go away. It's sort of like the temporary UDFs, like user-defined functions. You have to define them with a semicolon and then immediately use them in the following query.
Jeremy, can you show where the dbt max partition variable is used?
Yeah, so I think I'm using it. Well, I can actually show. So I've been doing a lot of benchmarking work and using some BigQuery public data of Wikipedia page views from this year. And I basically was trying to compare all of the different strategies that we've now got, how they are performing at different data volumes, different kinds of modeling patterns. So the dynamic example here uses the dbt max partition right here. So if it's an incremental build, I'm saying, hey, build greater than, oh, and I have variables here to make this easy for myself, but let's say whatever the last partition was in this table, build for 3 days before that, let's say 3 days before that, and less than today, because I didn't want to get tripped up with data that's constantly updating, even though that's, of course, the point of incremental builds. But so I just wrote this right into the model SQL, not really thinking too hard about needing to like define a statement to create a Jinja variable to then call that Jinja variable and make sure that the formatting is all right. It's all kind of handled for me. Do people want to take a look at some of those benchmarking results? Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to show them.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes.
Cool. Thank you. So overview of my extremely scientific experiment here is I have 3 different kinds of models on top of my Wikipedia page views. One is just enriching the data, like adding a couple of columns. I basically flagged pages that were in any language about open source software, the defenestrations of Prague or covalent bonding, because hopefully one of those is interesting to everyone. So that's just enriched.
Do you want to explain what defenestration is, Jeremy?
For anybody who's, so it's the act of being thrown out of a window, and the 30 Years' War, which is one of the actually the most brutal conflicts in like Renaissance, pre-modern European history, began with someone being thrown out of a window. So feel free to look that up in your own time in any language. It's actually supported in a whole bunch. So the enriched version of this model is just adding some columns. It's just flagging like, hey, this is a page of interest. So it doesn't actually reduce dimensionality at all. It increases the amount of data. The source data is about 7 gigabytes per day, and this is actually 9 gigabytes per day. The aggregated version is just doing like a count star. It's just like summing up the total number of page views, a big aggregation. And it's only going to be about 500 kilobytes per day. That's like very, very small. And then I just tried to make some model that does something kind of in between. And I think this is the most common form of incremental modeling. It's going to be smaller size than the incremental table, but you still need to think about the data volume of the table you're merging into. And this is sort of where our where my long work has been headed. So then trying 4 different strategies here and trying a couple of different data volumes. So if we have 3 days in the old, like full refresh with 3 days of data, then try to merge 1 day of data back in, 7 days, 1 day back in, and so on, all the way up to 30 days of old and 3 days back in. And the things I'm most interested in are runtime, although this can be a little like less reliable, a little all over the place, depending. Cost, this should be super reliable. And then how those speed and cost change at scale. So I've got myself the best kind of data presentation, which is a pivot table in Google Sheets. But I basically just went down the line here and was recording how many gigabytes, how long it took to run for all of these models. And the output is, drumroll, the static insert overwrite method. So this is where you say, I'm running for 3 days. I know I'm running for 3 days. I will say exactly what those 3 days are. This is by far the most performant in terms of gigabytes, and also usually the quickest in terms of seconds. And that's across all 3 modeling paradigms, though because the aggregated version of this model is so small, it's kind of no real difference across the board. Now, the dynamic approach, because it needs to run a couple more queries in that script, right? It needs to get the max partition value to let you use that in your SQL. It needs to create a temp table. It needs to scan that temp table to get the distinct partition values, and then it runs a merge. It is actually going to scan more data at small volumes, but especially for some of these bigger modeling paradigms, when you have a big table that you're merging into, there does come a point where this insert overwrite dynamic approach becomes worth it. So you'll see that merge and merge clustered here. Merge is just our we're not trying anything. We're just gonna do what DBT used to do, and then merge clustered is the same exact thing, but with a cluster key now, and then shockingly is somehow slightly better. These are going to perform a lot better than the dynamic insert overwrite at small data volumes. This is just 3 days of old with 1 day of new. But then once you've got 30 days of old and you're trying to add 3 new, the dynamic insert overwrite is really starting to scale better and is kind of flattening its line out, where the other 2 are scaling almost linearly with the amount of overall data. I may have just overwhelmed everybody a little bit. I'm happy to field specific questions about these numbers. I'm also happy to just go to the place where I say, here's my hot takes.
I'm a little, I'm not sure what your hot takes are going to entail, so maybe you intended to hit these, but I'm curious if you could maybe opine to the extent you feel able about how you think this could change in the future based on what we understand about databases and the types of things that databases are able to do. Maybe some things that don't work quite the way you think that they will today. Yeah,
well, it's fair to say that I couldn't have imagined adding a cluster key being an improvement for a merge function when BigQuery has long said, really you just have to filter on partitions to get performance improvement there. So databases always sometimes move in mysterious and interesting ways. I think what we talked about yesterday, Drew, and what I see being an area of definite growth is getting the max partition value. That's really all this query is doing. Just select max date day, and that's the column that this table is partitioned by. It surprises me that this scans as much data as it does, given that this feels like it should be a metadata query. And maybe that's something that BigQuery will improve and better support in the future. It's a very, very quick query. It almost feels like it could be hitting metadata. And the same is even true. This is hitting half a gigabyte to get the distinct values of the partition column in the temp table, which we've just created. So I definitely see a world where these two numbers come down and the time it takes to run them come down, in which case the dynamic insert overwrite approach here might become much more competitive with like the naive clustered merge.
I totally buy that. I think when we were ideating this change, I was under the false impression that those lookups on a partition column, so distinct values in the max partition time, I was under the errant assumption that they were going to be metadata queries and would cost $0.00.
Yeah.
But that is not the case.
And I think it's okay because at scale, this approach, this dynamic approach, while not as good as the approach where you are the like Airflow data engineer who defines all of the dates you want to run for exactly, it's still a lot better than the naive. It is slower, but that's okay. That's something we're used to. Like on Spark, the dynamic partition overwrite is a lot slower than static partition overwrite. I think what we want, is like the areas for growth there are things we hope BigQuery improves. And although, Drew, we haven't gotten a chance to test this, maybe we wouldn't be surprised if there are free or very quick ways to get these kinds of information from the non-SQL BigQuery APIs. And hopefully they add better SQL support for the same.
Yeah, I think that's totally possible. Just intuitively, BigQuery must have the ability to identify the partitions that exist without actually scanning the data inside of those partitions.
Right.
Because you can filter on a partition and by definition not scan data outside of those partitions. So
right.
Yeah, it's not super surprising that it doesn't work exactly the way that we would identify maybe at first blush, but like I have an open Twitter DM to Felipe Hoffa. Ask him if he wants to join office hours and talk to us about BigQuery, but maybe that was too late notice. So I feel confident that we can get in touch with some folks from BigQuery and figure out what's on the roadmap, or if there are good ways to do this too. And if anyone here has any connects at Google, we'd sure love to talk to you about talking to them.
Yeah. Just because we've got maybe a couple of minutes left, my other opinions on this are really just like a great more functionality, what to do. I think the finding here is that the naive merge approach with a cluster key is really good, like surprisingly good, up to, let's say, a data volume of about 50 gigabytes, at which point it's time to start thinking about insert overwrite. And the dynamic approach, while a little bit slower, is going to scale better, and it prevents you needing to think about, how do I want to write macros to get the days right? What if my DBT run fails for a couple of days? Doing a just always last 3 days relative static insert, it would miss potentially some data, and I would need then some way to go backfill it. Like, that's all sort of conventional data engineering land. If you feel very comfortable living in that land, you can jump right to the static insert overwrite, and it's going to be fastest and cheapest. If that's uncomfortable, I think the dynamic approach is still pretty compelling, and we hope, for all the reasons we just mentioned, it's only going to get better.
Cool. Thanks, Jericho.
Absolutely.
Did you have any particularly spicy hot takes that you haven't already shared on BigQuery incrementalism?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the syntax here can be surprising. Like, the way that we implement insert overwrite is using this so to speak constant false predicate. It's still a merge function, but it's like merge on false. It's a merge where you never match up. So yeah, it's like surprising syntax, and I know, Drew, it took a couple of days to figure out exactly what was going on. Or like why it worked, because it did work, to get the partition replacement right.
Sure. All right. Anyone have any thoughts or questions, comments, ideas, hopes, aspirations?
I have a question for Jeremy, so you guys can hear me. So Jeremy, I just absolutely love this stuff. This is the only one thing I absolutely love about databases, like finding and performance tuning it. So would it be possible for you to share like the how did you come up with this? So basically the start part. And when are you going to write a blog post about it or a discourse post? Because this is very, very juicy information, and I think that it's a field where it lacks a lot of information on the BigQuery documentation. And the thing about the cluster keys you found, it's like those hidden gems, and who knows how many there are.
Yeah, I'm definitely hoping to get this published, probably on Discourse, probably one that's an overview of the new functionality, and maybe a separate one that's like the very specific benchmarking work. And I don't know if there's a better presentation method than just this Google sheet and my silly pivot tables. I'm open to suggestions. I think first we need to make sure that the code is right and that it ships out with 0.16.0 correctly, because everything I've described is not exactly what was in the last release, and especially the finding around clustered merge performance improvements that came within the last 24 to 36 hours. But yes, I would love to put this in a place where you can also get your hands on it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So just a suggestion, the best presentation method is presented, not presented being the worst presentation method. So yeah, doesn't matter how you present it, just get it out there.
Right on.
I have a question about the cluster merge. So are you adding a cluster key every time there's not one, or are you saying, you know, we should add one?
Yeah, this doesn't totally make sense to me yet. Like I was expecting maybe something like if the cluster key is the same as the unique key, so that it's trying to do a merge on something that is clustered, like, okay, I guess I could wrap my head around a performance improvement there. And then even maybe if the cluster key is somehow correlated with the unique key, like a session ID and an event ID where events are always contained within sessions. But it seems like literally no matter which column you cluster by, you get some performance improvement in a merge. So I don't really see any downside. Like the only downside potentially is like, oh, it would be too bad to cluster by column just for the merge improvement when I actually want to be clustering by this other column for like filter group by performance reasons. But it seems like you can cluster by whatever you want. So really there's no downside. I don't see why you ever wouldn't.
But it's
guess
something that we would add manually, right? It's not being added automatically.
Oh, that's true. Yes, this is like you should go into models that you config materialized incremental and just also add a cluster by config.
Okay. I haven't actually looked into the cluster functionality in BigQuery, but I'm wondering if it has to do with kind of like how it hashes the data and how it splits it in kind of like a distribution key, you know, in Redshift terms.
Yeah, I mean, so this can actually
but then if it were like that, I mean, if you pick the wrong column, it may get at like a hot spot or something. So kind of interesting.
Yeah, I really don't know. You know, Klaus's take on this was like, there are regularly times when BigQuery is masquerading as a database, but secretly is probably some kind of Elasticsearch or some kind of who knows what under the hood. And we've like hit on a little glitch in the matrix here. I'm just kidding. Drew, what were you going to say?
No, Pedro, I think your instincts are pretty much the same as mine. I bet if you cluster by anything, BigQuery just does something different, laying out the data in whatever physical storage it uses. And what makes sense to me is that you could see performance improvements even if you're not clustering on the thing that you're merging on, just because maybe it computes statistics for those clusters and it can benefit from those things. But it is surprising that it would cost anything different because, well, maybe if it's able to compute statistics at a bucket level, it makes sense.
Basically just says like store more metadata on my table.
Yeah. And you know, the funny thing is just that BigQuery is very explicit about like the one way that it prices queries is data scanned. And the one way that you can impact that is by using filters on the partition column. And this proved to not be the case there. So it's definitely something we should research some more.
Well, and what could be happening too is like in Snowflake, when you, because it's actually altering the sort order, it can therefore potentially make the data more compressible. And then you have to start hypothesizing how exactly they split storage and compute on the back end, which I think has to be something closer to Snowflake because of what they're doing, right? So it doesn't surprise me at all that giving it a cluster key actually makes the data more compressible because of sorting, which then improves scan performance and all of that, right?
Yeah, it's a really wonderful point.
Good point. I remember watching a presentation from Google. They were talking about, I mean, it was around data engineering, and they had an example that had partition only, partition plus cluster key, and they did show an improvement in cost and time. So I'll see if I can dig it and post it.
Yeah, I think that's always been true for certain kinds of like aggregation queries. And that's what they have documented as like the primary use case for clustering. I tried to find anything that was like cluster, search like cluster, BigQuery, merge, better. And I came on one Stack Overflow post from like last year, August, where someone asked exactly this question, like, hey, if I cluster on the merge match key, like, will that improve performance? And someone with a lot of upvotes said like, nope. So that's what leads me to hypothesize that this is in the last 6 months. That's my archaeology for you.
It's very scientific.
Yeah, right.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. We can very much continue this discussion if anyone has any thoughts or findings, maybe over in the BigQuery channel. Be interesting. And otherwise, thanks very much for joining. Jericho, thanks for presenting your findings. It's all very exciting stuff. And otherwise, we'll talk to you next time. We're going to be doing more of these over the next couple of weeks with everyone sheltering in place. So we'll talk to you soon.
Bye, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
You guys, bye.